Simple black woman found a crying janitor in the rain, unaware he'd lost everything. The thunder rolled across Detroit like God himself was rearranging furniture upstairs. Leah Carter pulled her worn coat tighter as she hurried toward the Mercy Street shelter, her sneakers splashing through puddles that reflected the harsh street lights. She was already running late for her volunteer shift, again. Between her morning job at the grocery store and her evening shift at the diner, these 3 hours at the shelter were supposed to be her break. But Leah had never been good at saying no to people who needed help. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the alley beside the shelter in stark white. That's when she saw him. A man sat crumpled against the brick wall next to the dumpster, his body shaking, though whether from cold or sobs, Leah couldn't tell. Rain streamed down his dark skin, and his custodian's uniform clung to his thin frame like a second skin. The name tag on his chest was too waterlogged to read, but the pale blue shirt and navy pants told her he worked at the hospital 3 blocks over. Most people would have hurried past. It was nearly midnight, and this wasn't exactly the safest neighborhood. But Leah had learned long ago that broken people weren't dangerous. They were just broken. "Excuse me," she called softly, stepping closer. "Sir? Are you all right?" The man's head snapped up, and Leah's breath caught. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, like someone had scooped out his soul and left only the shell behind. He looked to be in his 40s, with close-cropped hair and a beard that had seen better days. But it was the complete emptiness in his gaze that made her heart clench. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I didn't mean to. I should go." He tried to stand, but his legs gave out, sending him back against the wall with a soft thud. The yellow custodial cart beside him was overturned, cleaning supplies scattered across the wet pavement like casualties of some invisible battle. Hey, Leah said, kneeling beside him without thinking about her uniform getting dirty. "You don't have to go anywhere. What's your name?" The man stared at her for a long moment, as if the question required translation from another language. I don't." His voice cracked. "I can't remember." Something cold that had nothing to do with the rain settled in Leah's stomach. She'd seen her share of trauma at the shelter: veterans with PTSD, mothers fleeing abuse, kids aged out of foster care, but this felt different. This man wasn't just hurt. He was lost in a way that went deeper than directions. "Okay," she said gently, the same tone she used when her 8-year-old son Marcus had nightmares. "That's okay. Do you know what happened? Are you hurt?" He shook his head slowly, then winced as if the movement caused pain. "I woke up. I was in the hospital. They said I was found unconscious near the river 3 days ago. No ID, no wallet, nothing." His hands trembled as he spoke. "They gave me this job, said I could sleep in the storage room until I figured things out. And tonight? Tonight they said they needed the room for supplies." His laugh was bitter, broken. "Guess even charity has its limits." Leah looked at this man, this stranger whose name she didn't even know, and felt something shift inside her chest. She thought of Marcus, asleep in their tiny apartment 6 blocks away, and how many nights she'd lain awake wondering what would happen to him if something happened to her. She thought of all the times strangers had looked right through her, as if kindness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Without a word, she stood and popped open her umbrella, a small, battered thing with 2 broken spokes that she'd bought from a gas station 2 years ago. She held it over his head, instantly getting soaked herself. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you inside." The man looked up at her with something approaching wonder. "You don't understand. I have nowhere to go. No money. No. The shelter's not full tonight," Leah interrupted. "I volunteer here. They'll have a bed. But I already tried. They said that to John Doe," Leah said with a small smile. "But they haven't met my friend yet. It took 20 minutes to get him processed." Leah had to call in favors with Margaret, the night supervisor, and promised to cover an extra shift next week. But eventually, the man was registered, officially now as John Doe, and assigned to bed number 12 in the men's section. As they walked through the shelter's fluorescent-lit hallways, Leah noticed things about him that didn't quite add up. His posture, despite the exhaustion, was perfectly straight. He held doors open for her without thinking, and when he spoke to Margaret, his words were carefully chosen, almost formal. These weren't the mannerisms of someone who'd been living rough. But it was his hands that really caught her attention. They were clean, too clean for someone who'd been on the streets. And there were scars across his knuckles and palms, faint white lines that looked like burn marks. Old ones? "Thank you," he said when they reached his assigned bed. The simple words carried the weight of something much heavier. "I don't know why you." "Because someone helped me once when I needed it," Leah said simply. "And someday, when you're back on your feet, you'll help someone else. That's how it works." She handed him a care package from the shelter's supplies: soap, a towel, a change of clothes that looked like they might fit. "I work here Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights. If you need anything." "Why?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended. "You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous." Leah studied his face in the harsh light. Despite the exhaustion and confusion, despite the fact that he truly didn't seem to know who he was, there was something gentle in his eyes. Something broken, yes, but not beyond repair. "My mama used to say that we're all just walking each other home," she said. "Sometimes the path gets dark, and we need someone to hold the flashlight for a while." As she walked back through the rain toward her car, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to John Doe than met the eye. Something about the way he'd automatically straightened the scattered cleaning supplies, or how he'd apologized for taking up space, as if kindness was something he wasn't used to receiving. She thought about the scars on his hands and the formal way he spoke. She thought about how he'd flinched when a car backfired outside, and how his eyes had tracked the security cameras mounted in the shelter's corners with the awareness of someone who understood surveillance. Most of all, she thought about the overwhelming sadness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fever. This wasn't just a man who'd lost his memory. This was a man who'd lost everything else too, and maybe didn't want to remember what that everything was. As she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex, Leah made a mental note to bring him some of Marcus's old books tomorrow. Something told her that John Doe was the kind of man who might find comfort in stories, even if he couldn't remember his own. She had no idea that the man she just helped was about to turn her simple act of kindness into something that would change both their lives forever. 3 weeks into John Doe's stay at the shelter, Leah began to notice the small things that didn't fit. It started with the way he held his plastic fork during dinner service. Not like someone accustomed to cafeteria trays and donated meals, but with the unconscious precision of a man who'd once known fine dining. His back remained ramrod straight even when exhausted, and he never failed to say please and thank you to the shelter staff, not the casual politeness of someone trying to make a good impression, but the ingrained courtesy of someone raised with different expectations. "Evening, Miss Carter," he said when she arrived for her Thursday shift, rising slightly from his chair in the common room. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it made her pause. Most of the shelter residents called her by her first name, or simply nodded acknowledgement. John's formality felt like muscle memory. "Just Leah," she reminded him for the dozenth time, settling into the chair across from him. "How was your day?" "Productive," he replied, though something flickered behind his eyes. "They had me helping with maintenance again." That was another puzzle piece. John had somehow become the shelter's unofficial repair specialist, fixing everything from leaky faucets to the temperamental heating system. Today's victory was the vending machine in the lobby, an ancient beast that had been eating quarters for months. "You should have seen him work," Margaret had told Leah earlier, shaking her head in amazement. "Took that machine apart like he'd built it himself. Had it purring like a kitten within an hour." When Leah had asked John about his mechanical skills, he'd gone quiet, staring at his scarred hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I suppose I must have learned somewhere," he'd said finally. "I just can't remember where." Those scars told their own story. Leah had spent enough time around working people to recognize different types of injuries. These weren't the random cuts and burns of someone who'd worked with his hands out of necessity. They were precise, deliberate marks, the kind that came from working with sophisticated equipment under pressure. Maybe even dangerous equipment. "John," she said now, pulling a worn paperback from her bag. "I brought you something." His face brightened, another small inconsistency. Most people experiencing homelessness were focused on immediate needs: food, warmth, safety. John seemed genuinely excited by the prospect of reading. "What is it?" he asked, accepting the book with careful hands. "Marcus finished it last week. Thought you might enjoy it." The book was a middle-grade adventure story, nothing fancy, but John examined it like it was made of gold. As he opened to the first page, classical music drifted from the radio in the corner, some local station's evening programming. The change in John was instantaneous and jarring. His entire body went rigid, the book slipping from suddenly trembling fingers. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and his eyes darted around the room like he was looking for an escape route. "John!" Leah reached across the space between them. "What's wrong?" But he was already standing, backing away from the radio with something approaching panic. "I'm sorry," he gasped. I need some air." He practically fled the room, leaving Leah staring after him in confusion. She glanced at the radio, where Vivaldi's Four Seasons played innocently in the background. What could possibly be triggering about classical music? She found him 20 minutes later on the shelter's back steps, his head in his hands. "Better?" she asked, settling beside him. He nodded without looking up. "I don't know what happened. The music, it was familiar, but in a way that hurt. Do you want to talk about it?" "There's nothing to talk about." His voice carried a finality that warned against pushing. "I don't remember anything useful. Just fragments that don't make sense." But late that night, as Leah was finishing her paperwork, she heard him talking in his sleep. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. His bed was near the office, and sound carried in the old building. At first it was just mumbling, the incoherent rambling of dreams. Then, clear as day. "Ava, please. Grayson Corp can't, the merger." Leah's pen stilled. Grayson Corporation. She'd heard that name recently, but couldn't place where. Over the following days, she found herself paying closer attention to John's quirks. The way he flinched whenever a luxury car passed the shelter's windows, as if the sight of wealth caused physical pain. How he instinctively avoided the local news broadcasts, changing channels or leaving the room whenever financial reports came on. The careful way he counted and recounted his few possessions, like someone who'd once had much more to keep track of. It was Margaret who finally connected the dots. "Strangest thing happened today," she mentioned during their shift change. "Some private investigator came by asking questions. Professional-looking woman with an expensive suit and a briefcase full of photos." "Photos of what?" "Missing person case. Some big-shot businessman who disappeared months ago. Grayson Monroe, I think his name was. Runs some kind of corporation." Margaret shrugged. "Asked if we'd seen anyone matching his description. Offered a reward and everything." The blood drained from Leah's face. "What did you tell her?" "That we get dozens of John Does through here. Without a clearer description." Margaret trailed off, studying Leah's expression. "Why? You think you've seen this guy?" Leah forced her voice to remain steady. "Just curious." But as she watched John through the office window, carefully organizing donated books in the common room with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to order and control, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at a man who'd lost far more than his memory. And if someone was willing to pay a private investigator to find him, the question wasn't just who John Doe really was. The question was, who was he running from? The friendship grew quietly, like morning light creeping across a windowsill. It started with books. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, Leah would bring something new, sometimes Marcus's outgrown chapter books, sometimes novels she'd picked up from the dollar store. John devoured them all with a hunger that went beyond simple entertainment. He read like someone rediscovering a lost love, his fingers tracing the words as if they held secrets to who he used to be. "You were an English teacher, weren't you?" he asked one evening, watching her organize the shelter's small library with practiced efficiency. Leah laughed, shaking her head. "Grocery store clerk by day, diner waitress by night, volunteer by choice. But I've always loved books. My mama read to me every night until I was 12, even when she was working double shifts. She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Leah's voice softened. "She used to say that books were like windows. You could look through them and see anywhere you wanted to go." John was quiet for a moment then. "Where do you want to go?" The question caught her off guard. Most people asked about her past or present, never her dreams. "Honestly? I want to open a place where kids can discover that same magic. A reading cafe, maybe. Somewhere children can curl up with hot chocolate and get lost in stories." She gestured around the makeshift library. "I've been saving for years, but banks don't exactly line up to give loans to single mothers with spotty credit." She shrugged, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Someday, though. Tell me about it," John said, settling into his chair. "This dream cafe of yours." And she did. For the next hour, Leah painted pictures with words, describing the cozy reading nook she'd create, the children's laughter that would fill the space, the way she'd match every child with the perfect book. John listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the weight of dreams deferred. Gradually, their conversations expanded beyond books. John began joining her for the simple meals she'd heat up during break time, usually instant soup or microwave dinners from the shelter's kitchen. But something about his approach to food bothered her. "Have you been eating enough?" she asked one Thursday, watching him pick at a cup of ramen noodles. "I'm fine," he replied automatically, but Leah caught the way his hands shook slightly around the plastic spoon. The next week, she brought ingredients instead of books. "We're cooking," she announced, leading him to the shelter's small kitchen. "Real food." "Leah, I don't think I know how." "Then you'll learn." She started simple: scrambled eggs, grilled cheese sandwiches, basic pasta. But as John worked beside her, something fascinating emerged. His knife skills were impeccable, too perfect for someone who claimed no memory of cooking. He seasoned by instinct, his movements economical and precise. "Where did you learn to julienne vegetables like that?" she asked, watching him transform a carrot into perfect matchsticks. John paused, staring at the knife in his hand. I'm not sure. It just feels right." The cooking lessons became a ritual. Every Saturday after her shift, they'd spend an hour in the kitchen, John relearning skills that his hands remembered even when his mind didn't. He never complained about the simple ingredients or the cramped space. Instead, he approached each lesson with a gratitude that made Leah's chest tight. "You know," she said one Saturday, "you should come to church with Marcus and me tomorrow. Nothing heavy, just community. And Reverend Williams makes the best coffee in Detroit." John hesitated. "I'm not sure I'd belong in the house of God." "Everyone belongs somewhere, John. Maybe especially the lost ones." The next morning, John Doe sat in the third pew of New Hope Baptist Church, wearing a donated suit that almost fit and holding a hymnal like it might bite him. But when the choir began to sing, something shifted in his posture. Not recognition exactly, but a deep, aching familiarity that made his eyes water. After the service, as they walked to Leah's beat-up Honda, Marcus chattering excitedly about the youth group's upcoming book drive, John stopped suddenly. "The reading cafe?" he said. "You could call it Story Garden. Every child gets their own chapter to grow." The suggestion was so perfect, so exactly what Leah had been trying to articulate, that she felt tears prick her eyes. "That's beautiful." "Yeah, well," John said, looking embarrassed. "Just a thought." It was the following Tuesday when everything changed. Leah arrived at the shelter to find water dripping steadily from the ceiling in the common room. Margaret was on the phone with a plumber, her voice tight with stress over the quoted repair costs. Let me take a look, John offered quietly. John, honey, this isn't a leaky faucet, Leah said gently. This looks like a major pipe issue. But John was already examining the water damage, his eyes tracking the stain patterns across the ceiling with professional assessment. He borrowed a flashlight from Margaret and disappeared into the maintenance closet, emerging 20 minutes later with a clear diagnosis. The main supply line has a stress fracture where it meets the junction box, he said, sketching a rough diagram on the back of an envelope. It's violating section 605.3 of the plumbing code. You can't have that kind of bend radius without proper support brackets. The whole assembly needs to be rerouted according to IPC standards, probably 18 inches to the left to avoid the electrical conduit. The room fell silent. Margaret's mouth hung open. Leah stared at John, whose face had gone pale as he realized what he'd just said. I mean, he stammered, I think that might be the problem. John, Leah said carefully, where did you learn plumbing codes? The question hung in the air like smoke. John's hands were shaking again, and that familiar panic was creeping into his eyes. But instead of pressing him, instead of demanding answers, Leah simply nodded. Well, she said, sounds like we should listen to the expert. She never asked him to explain. Never pushed for details about how a man with no memory could recite building codes from memory. Instead, she simply treated him the same way she always had, with kindness, respect, and the kind of patient grace that asked nothing in return. But that night, as she tucked Marcus into bed, her son asked the question she'd been avoiding. Mama, is Mr. John really who he says he is? Looking into her 8-year-old's wise eyes, Leah realized she'd been wondering the same thing for weeks. I don't know, baby, she said honestly. But does it matter? He's our friend either way. She just hoped that when the truth finally surfaced, their friendship would be strong enough to survive it. You're absolutely right. I apologize for that oversight. Let me write section 4 now, which should come between section 3 and section 5. Here's section 4 in 800 words. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening, just as Leah was finishing her shift at the shelter. She was in the office, updating intake records, when she heard the commotion from the common room, raised voices, the scrape of chairs, and then Margaret's sharp call for help. Leah rushed out to find a crowd gathered around the overturned coffee table, where John lay motionless on the floor. What happened? Leah demanded, dropping to her knees beside him. The ceiling fan, stammered Robert, one of the newer residents. A bolt came loose, and John was trying to fix it. The whole thing came down and caught him right in the head. Blood trickled from a gash above John's left temple, almost exactly where Leah imagined his original injury must have been. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, and when she took his hand, his fingers felt ice cold. I called 911, Margaret said, her voice tight with worry. Ambulance should be here any minute. But as they waited, something strange began to happen. John's lips started moving, forming words that came out in disconnected fragments. The merger documents. Ava, I'm sorry. Conference room B. The foundation, 30 million in the Cayman account. Leah exchanged glances with Margaret. These weren't the confused ramblings of a head injury. They were too specific, too detailed. Grayson Corp hostile takeover, board meeting Thursday. Tell Davidson the Shanghai deal is off. John? Leah whispered, squeezing his hand. Can you hear me? His eyes snapped open, but they weren't focused on her. Instead, they darted around the room with wild panic, as if he was seeing something entirely different from the shelter's familiar walls. Where are the blueprints? He gasped, trying to sit up. The Detroit project, Ava's reading centers, we can't let them cancel the funding. John, you're at the shelter, Leah said gently, trying to keep him calm. You're safe. But he wasn't hearing her. His hands clawed at the air as if reaching for invisible documents. 27 locations, literacy programs, she made me promise. The paramedics arrived and immediately began their assessment, but John continued his stream of consciousness throughout the ambulance ride. Leah rode with him, listening as fragments of a life she'd never imagined spilled from his lips like water from a broken dam. At the hospital, they sedated him for the CT scan. The doctor, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, assured Leah that there was no serious damage, just a concussion that had apparently triggered something neurological. Sometimes, the doctor explained, a second head trauma can actually restore memories lost from the first injury. It's rare, but not unheard of. His brain is essentially rebooting itself. For 3 days, John drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between two worlds. Sometimes he was John Doe, asking for Leah and worrying about missing his volunteer's shift. Other times he was someone else entirely, someone who spoke about board meetings and international investments with the casual authority of a man accustomed to power. Leah maintained her vigil, reading to him when he was awake and holding his hand when he wasn't. She watched him struggle with fragments of memory that felt both foreign and familiar, like pieces of a puzzle he'd forgotten he was supposed to solve. On the 4th morning, she arrived to find his bed empty. "Where is he?" she asked the nurse, panic rising in her chest. "He checked himself out about an hour ago," the nurse replied, consulting her charts. "Said he remembered where he belonged." Leah's heart sank. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had seen it building in the way John's posture had begun to change, the way his speech patterns had grown more formal. But she hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly, so completely. She found the note on his bedside table, written in handwriting that was somehow both familiar and foreign. "Leah, you saved a man even he couldn't recognize. I don't have words for what your kindness meant to me during the darkest period of my life. Please know that John Doe will always be grateful for the woman who held an umbrella over his head and asked for nothing in return. Some gifts can never be repaid, only passed forward. G." As Leah folded the note with trembling fingers, she realized that she was grieving, not for a death, but for the end of something beautiful and simple. John Doe, the broken man who'd found peace in small acts of kindness, was gone. In his place was someone else, someone who belonged to a world of wealth and responsibility that she could barely imagine. That evening, as she tucked Marcus into bed, her son asked the question she'd been dreading. "Is Mr. John coming back?" Leah looked into her child's trusting eyes and felt her heart break a little. "I don't think so, baby. I think he had to go home. But this was his home," Marcus said with 8-year-old logic. "We were his family." As she kissed her son goodnight, Leah wondered if the man who had been John Doe would remember that. Or if the weight of his real life would push their friendship into the category of things that happened to someone else, in what felt like another lifetime. 3 days later, she got her answer when the news broke across every television screen in Detroit. The news hit Detroit like a lightning strike on a clear day. Leah was wiping down tables at the diner when the breaking news alert flashed across the television mounted above the counter. She glanced up absently, then froze, the dish rag falling from her numb fingers. "Billionaire Grayson Monroe found alive after 8-month disappearance." The man on the screen wore an expensive suit and stood behind a podium bristling with microphones. His hair was professionally styled, his face clean-shaven, but the eyes, those haunted, gentle eyes, belonged to the man she'd known as John Doe. "Mr. Monroe," a reporter called out, "can you tell us where you've been for the past 8 months?" Grayson Monroe, John, looked directly into the camera, and for a moment, Leah could swear he was looking right at her. "I was lost," he said simply. "In more ways than one. But I was found by people who showed me what kindness looks like when it asks for nothing in return." The diner manager, Carl, whistled low. "Can you believe it? Guy's worth like $2 billion, and he's been missing all this time. Says here he was found wandering near the Detroit River with amnesia. Some kind of head injury." Leah's legs felt weak. She sank into the nearest booth, her eyes glued to the screen as reporters peppered him with questions about hostile takeovers, missing merger documents, and something about his late wife's foundation. "The Ava Monroe Foundation will resume operations immediately," Grayson was saying. "My wife believed in the power of literacy to transform lives. Before her death, she and I had planned to fund reading programs in underserved communities. It's time to honor that commitment. Ava. The name he'd whispered in his sleep. This is insane, Carl continued, oblivious to Leah's shock. Guy disappears for 8 months, and his company's stock jumps 15% just because he's back. That's the power of money, I guess. But Leah wasn't thinking about money. She was thinking about gentle hands teaching Marcus to tie his shoes. About a man who'd cried when she brought him a paperback novel. About someone who'd fixed the shelter's plumbing while living in that very shelter himself. That evening, she sat Marcus down after dinner. Remember Mr. John from the shelter? She asked carefully. Marcus nodded. He taught me how to make paper airplanes. Is he okay? I haven't seen him in a while. He's fine, baby. But it turns out he wasn't exactly who we thought he was. She explained as gently as she could, watching her son's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a wisdom that sometimes startled her. So he's rich now? Marcus asked. He was always rich, sweetie. He just didn't remember. But he was still nice to us when he didn't have to be. That's what matters, right? Out of the mouths of babes. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of media coverage. Leah learned more about Grayson Monroe's life than she'd ever known about John Doe's. How he'd built his empire from nothing after his parents died in a car accident. How he met his wife, Ava, at a literacy charity event. How her death from cancer 2 years ago had sent him into a spiral of grief and workaholism that worried everyone around him. The official story was that he'd been found unconscious near the river after what appeared to be a mugging gone wrong. The head injury had caused retrograde amnesia, and he'd spent months in various hospitals and shelters with no memory of his identity. His recovery had been triggered by a minor accident, something about falling and hitting his head again, jolting his memories back into place. Leah wondered if they'd ever tell the real story of how a kind woman named Leah Carter had held an umbrella over a crying man's head and changed both their lives forever. She was getting ready for work on a Tuesday morning when she heard the car doors slam outside her apartment complex. Through her window, she watched 2 black SUVs pull up to the curb, their windows tinted dark as midnight. Her heart hammered as she recognized the figure stepping out of the second vehicle. Grayson Monroe looked nothing like the broken man she'd known. Gone was the donated clothing and the defeated posture. In their place stood a man who commanded attention simply by existing, tall, confident, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. But then he looked up at her window, and she saw John in his eyes. He wasn't alone. 2 security guards flanked him, their eyes constantly scanning the parking lot, and a woman in a business suit followed close behind, speaking rapidly into a phone. Leah's hands shook as she buzzed him up. When she opened her apartment door, he stood alone in the hallway. The entourage had remained downstairs, giving them privacy she suspected he'd had to fight for. "Hi," he said, and his voice carried the same gentle uncertainty she remembered. "Hi yourself," she managed. They stood there for a moment, 2 people who'd shared something profound trying to figure out how to navigate the distance that money and status had suddenly placed between them. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "For leaving the way I did. For not saying goodbye. For not being who I thought you were? For not being who I thought I was," he corrected. "When the memories came back, it was like waking up from a dream. Everything about John Doe felt like it had happened to someone else. But you," he swallowed hard. "You were real. You are real. And I needed you to know that." Leah stepped aside, letting him into her small living room. He looked around, taking in the second-hand furniture, the photographs of Marcus, the stack of books on every available surface, and she saw something relax in his shoulders. "This feels more like home than anywhere I've been in years," he said quietly. "Even with your mansion and your billions? Especially with my mansion and my billions." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "I have something for you. Grayson, if this is money." "It's not money," he said quickly. "Well, not exactly. It's an investment. In a dream. With trembling fingers, Leah opened the envelope. Inside were business documents, architectural plans, and a set of keys. At the top of the first page, in elegant script, were the words, Leah's Story Garden, where every child gets a chapter. There's a property 3 blocks from Marcus's school, Grayson explained, his words coming fast, nervous. It used to be a bookstore. The layout is perfect for what you described, reading nooks, a small cafe area, space for children's programs. It's yours. Fully funded, no strings attached. Leah's vision blurred. I can't accept this. Yes, you can. Because it's not charity, Leah. It's an investment in something Ava would have loved. Something that matters. Something that will help other children fall in love with reading the way you helped me fall in love with living again. But the money is just paper. What you gave me when I had nothing, that was real wealth. This is just me trying to balance the books. She looked up at him, this man who'd been both John Doe and Grayson Monroe, and realized that somehow, and possibly, he was still both. I miss you, she said simply. I miss you too, he replied. More than I knew how to say. And in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of her modest life and his extravagant gesture, Leah understood that some friendships transcend circumstances. Some bonds survive even the shock of discovering that the person you thought you knew was someone else entirely. The real miracle wasn't that a billionaire had returned from the finished. The real miracle was that kindness had found a way to flourish in the space between 2 very different worlds. 6 months later, Leah stood in the doorway of Leah's Story Garden, watching the morning light stream through the large windows and illuminate the cozy reading nooks she'd only dreamed about for so long. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of new books, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the corner where Marcus was leading a group of first graders through their favorite picture books. The transformation had been remarkable. What had once been a dusty, abandoned bookstore was now a warm haven filled with overstuffed armchairs, colorful bean bags, and shelves upon shelves of carefully curated children's books. The cafe counter gleamed with a vintage espresso machine that Grayson had insisted on. Every proper reading cafe needs proper coffee, he'd said with that smile that still reminded her of John Doe's quiet humor. Miss Leah, called out 7-year-old Destiny, bouncing over with a well-worn copy of Charlotte's Web, clutched in her small hands. I finished it. Wilbur gets to live. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Leah said, kneeling to the girl's level. What did you think of Charlotte? She was brave, Destiny said solemnly. Even when she was scared, she helped her friend. From across the room, Leah caught Marcus rolling his eyes good-naturedly. At 9 years old, he'd appointed himself the unofficial big brother to all the younger children who frequented the cafe, and he took the responsibility seriously. The bell above the door chimed, and Leah looked up to see Grayson entering, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual business attire. Over the past months, their friendship had settled into a comfortable rhythm. He'd stop by 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes to discuss the cafe's programs, sometimes just to sit in the corner with a book while children climbed over him like he was playground equipment. Morning, he said, handing her one of the cups. How's our reading champion doing today? Destiny just finished Charlotte's Web, Leah reported. I think we have another bookworm on our hands. They watched as the little girl carefully placed the book back on the shelf, then selected another one with the serious concentration of someone making an important decision. The after-school program is working well, Grayson observed. Mrs. Patterson from the elementary school says reading scores in her class are up 20% since you started the tutoring sessions. It's not me, Leah said, settling into one of the adult-sized chairs near the window. It's the magic of having a safe place to discover stories. These kids just needed someone to believe they could love reading. Sounds familiar, Grayson said quietly, and she knew he was thinking about those early days at the shelter when she'd handed him his first book. The cafe had exceeded even Leah's wildest dreams. They served simple fare, sandwiches, soup, coffee, and the best hot chocolate in Detroit, but the real nourishment came from the atmosphere. Children who never owned a book now had library cards and favorite authors. Parents who'd been intimidated by traditional libraries found themselves lingering over coffee while their kids explored new worlds. "I have something to tell you," Grayson said, and something in his tone made Leah look at him more closely. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news, I think. The Ava Monroe Foundation wants to expand the Story Garden model. We've identified 12 other cities where we could open similar spaces. Detroit would be the flagship, but imagine dozens of reading cafes across the country, all based on what you've built here." Leah's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. That's incredible. But I can't manage 12 cafes." "You wouldn't have to. We'd train local coordinators, people who understand their communities the way you understand yours. You'd oversee the program, make sure each location maintains the heart of what makes this place special." He leaned forward, excitement lighting up his features. "Leah, we could change how children across the country think about reading." "But I'm not a businesswoman," she protested. You're just the woman who saw a crying stranger in the rain and decided to help," Grayson interrupted gently. "You're just someone who believes every child deserves to fall in love with stories. That's exactly the kind of person we need leading this." Before Leah could respond, Marcus appeared at her elbow. "Mom, can Mr. Grayson help with story time today? The kids love when he does the dragon voice." "I don't know," Leah said, grinning at Grayson's mock-serious expression. "Do you think our dragon expert is up for it?" "I suppose I could be persuaded," Grayson said, standing and straightening his shoulders dramatically. "But only if we're reading the one about the Princess Knight." As he walked toward the reading circle, surrounded by eager children, Leah marveled at the journey that had brought them here. The man who'd once sat broken beside a dumpster, unable to remember his own name, was now planning to change the lives of children across the country. And she, a single mother who'd worked 2 jobs just to make ends meet, was being asked to lead a national initiative. Margaret from the shelter had stopped by the week before, shaking her head in amazement. "You know," she'd said, "in all my years of social work, I've never seen anything like this. Most of the time, we help people get back on their feet, and that's the end of the story. But this is like watching a miracle multiply." As Leah watched Grayson settle into the reading chair, his voice transforming into a fierce dragon's roar that made the children squeal with delight, she understood what Margaret meant. This wasn't just about one act of kindness or one friendship that had survived impossible circumstances. This was about the ripple effect of compassion. About how treating someone with dignity when they had nothing could plant seeds that grew into forests. About how the simple act of holding an umbrella over a stranger's head could bloom into a movement that would touch thousands of lives. "Miss Leah," Destiny called from the reading circle. "Come hear the story." As she walked toward the group of children, Leah realized that this was her story too. Not the dramatic tale of a missing billionaire or the headlines about mysterious disappearances, but the quieter, more profound story of what happened when 2 broken people chose to heal together. Every child in that circle would grow up knowing that stories mattered, that kindness was powerful, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply show up for someone else. They would carry that knowledge into the world, creating their own ripples of compassion. And someday, when they encountered their own crying strangers in the rain, they would remember the woman who taught them that you never know who you're saving when you choose kindness. In the end, that was the most beautiful story of all.